Good afternoon. I'm David Baker, Director of the Program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2026 PPE Lecture at the University of Michigan. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. For somebody doing what I'm about to do, it's a cliche to say that I won't waste much of your time. I like to think I'm not going to be quite wasting your time, but instead giving you some signals about why you should listen to our speaker, Rajiv Sethi. Professor Sethi is professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia, where he has served as chair of the department. And he is an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute, where he tells me he once shared an office with Cormac McCarthy. Must have been an interesting year. Broadly speaking, his work concerns how to act on limited information, especially how to discern the intentions and biases of strangers who we may be interacting with for the first time or trying to learn from. He's applied these ideas to a number of consequential social questions, including in criminal justice, in his book, Shadows of Doubt, Stereotypes, Crime, and the Pursuit of Justice, co-authored with Brendan O'Flaherty. He's also a subtle commentator on contemporary issues, both inside and outside the academy, at his blog, Imperfect Information. And today he's going to speak with us about the interpretation of signals. Welcome, Rajiv.
Oh, is it on now?
Yeah. I think it was just the wrong.
Okay. So thank you all for coming. The title of this talk is tentatively a title of a book that I'm working on while I'm on leave this year at Casbus at Stanford. And I'm aware that books with similar titles have been published by Sigmund Freud and Clifford Geertz. And so I might need to switch to something more modest at some point, but this is what I have for now. I'm going to start with an example from a poem by Longfellow on Paul Revere's Ride, which has a memorable line in it. You can see it up here highlighted, one if by land, two if by sea. And apparently, according to the poem, and also I think this is historically accurate, Revere asked the sexton of the North Church in Boston, this is at the start of the American Revolutionary War, to keep an eye out for the redcoats and to signal their arrival using lanterns in the belfry. And one if by land, two if by sea was to let people know about the mode of arrival. And this example was used by the philosopher David Lewis in his book Convention to argue that there's a certain arbitrariness to the meaning that we attach to messages. He could have said two if by land, one if by sea, and it would have worked just as well, as long as the sender of the message and the receiver of the message attach the same meaning to it, right? So, in this case, that consistency of meaning was achieved by what Lewis calls explicit agreement. So this is an example of what you might call an engineered signal. So an engineered signal is one whose meaning is determined by a single individual or entity, and it is accepted by others because it's in their interest to do so. If you think about road signs, for instance, or the phonetic alphabet or Morse code, these are engineered signals, and the attachment of the meaning to the message is relatively uncomplicated. There's huge literatures on designing these kind of signals in computer science and engineering because you want to have faithful transmission of information and so on, but that's not at all what I'm concerned with here. So I mentioned this to compare with the kinds of signals, the kinds of messages that I want to talk about today, which will not be the engineered signals. So what happens if a signal is not engineered? Then the meaning, I'm using signal, by the way, interchangeably with message, and I mean by that to be any carrier of information. So it's a very, very broad, encompassing, sweeping category. Maybe too sweeping, and that's something that you'll let me know at the end of the talk. So I'm interested in messages that are not engineered, in other words, whose meaning emerges through some sort of social process. Okay? And in order to, well, that still leaves a huge number of messages. You see some examples over here. So you have words and expressions. You have emoticons and emojis. You have tattoos and piercings, flags and insignia, standardized test scores, prices in markets, and so on and so forth. So really, we are completely surrounded by these things. The first line of my book is, we live in a sea of signals, which, we are completely surrounded by these things, and sometimes they're inconsequential. It doesn't matter if we misinterpret them or ignore them completely, but at other times they take on a great deal of significance, and it matters a lot for us whether or not we're interpreting them correctly, right? And so I'm interested in that latter class of situations. Okay, so we have this huge, almost everything is a signal, right? Because there's some imperfection of information in transmission. So to make the problem tractable, I want to just divide up this set of signals, this sea of signals, into 4 categories, which I'll call autonomous, forced, defensive, and abstract. So what I mean by an autonomous signal is one that people can adopt or abandon at will. Now, there may be quite severe costs, including peer pressures and other kinds of costs associated with the abandonment or adoption of autonomous signals. Nevertheless, it is something that people can do. So you can think about yard signs, you can think about bumper stickers on motor vehicles, you can think about pronouns in bios, you can think about slogans, expressions like, I'll give you some examples in a second. But there are plenty of signals even on this slide that I would consider to be autonomous in that sense. Then you have forced signals. So forced signals are things like markers of race, ethnicity, and gender, height and build. These are difficult or costly to falsify. And so in a sense, you can't avoid sending these signals. So they carry information. People make judgments about you. This is what the entire literature on stereotypes is about. And as Dave mentioned, was the topic of my earlier book with Dan O'Flaherty. But these are nevertheless still signals because people are interpreting something about you based on information that is being transmitted, but not willingly. It's not something that you're choosing to transmit. You're not adopting or abandoning at will. It's in some sense very costly to falsify or difficult. And then you have defensive signals. So defensive signals are signals that are bundled or paired with forced signals in order to mitigate the effects of those signals. So if your height or your build or your markers of race, ethnicity, gender are sending a message to somebody that causes them to behave in ways that are detrimental to you, you may choose to bundle that with additional signals. And they are autonomous because you're adopting it, or abandoning it freely. But what makes them different from the first class of signals is that they are done for a specific purpose to mitigate the effects of the forced signals. And I'll give some examples of this in a minute. And finally, abstract signals. These are signals like prices in markets or standardized test scores. These are the hardest in some sense to interpret, although sometimes people think that they're very easy to interpret. But I think that the correct interpretation of these signals is really very, very consequential. And so I put them together in this umbrella, right? And this entire project is designed to see if one can say something useful about this universe of signals, the non-engineered signals, from a particular perspective. That perspective, relies on statistical inference and strategic incentives. So those are the 2 themes that is in some ways familiar to the economists in the audience, but I will have to move well beyond economics because this has been looked at, these kinds of issues have been looked at in all kinds of disciplines, and I'll refer to those in a second. But basically, these 4 categories, autonomous, forced, defensive, and abstract signals, can all, this is the argument I'm trying to make, can all be usefully viewed from the perspective of strategic incentives and statistical inference, and I want to make that case to you today. So a very rough outline of the book that I'm trying to put together. I have, chapters drafted to some degree or another, which are on expressions and impressions, public disagreement, interpretation of prices, the wisdom of crowds, the meaning of merit and crime and punishment. And today, in the interest of time, I'll just keep my remarks to an hour. I think after that, I'll be trying your patience. But I'll focus on expressions and impressions, and then the 3 things that you see highlighted there: prices, wisdom of crowds, and the meaning of merit. And they all have some connection to important policy questions that are facing us as a society today. Okay, let's start with expressions and impressions. So prior to 2015, by the way, the word of the year, the Oxford word of the year in 2015 was not a word at all. It was an emoji. It was on that earlier slide. The laughing face with tears of joy emoji was the word of the year for 2015. But also in 2015, the Unicode consortium, which determines what appears on your keyboard, what kind of shortcuts are available to you universally worldwide, right? That can facilitate comparison, so that something you type on a keyboard appears in precisely the same way for somebody who's looking at it, let's say in Japan or Nigeria. They introduced what are called skin tone modifiers for the thumbs up emoji and for a variety of emojis that are related to body parts. And so you could indicate thumbs up. Thumbs up prior to 2015, you had the choice of what's sometimes called Simpson's yellow, and that was all you could do. You want to say, oh, I approve of this, or good job. You could just do that yellow thumbs up, right? But then now you have these skin tone modifiers that were introduced in 2015, and they were popular. So they were adopted by people at quite significant rates, and they continue to be quite popular. But they were adopted at very different rates by people based on their own skin tone. So I'll show you some data from a study out of Edinburgh, but there are many others that show you the same phenomenon. But people with darker skin tones tended to adopt the skin tone modifiers at much higher rates, 80 or 90%, than people with lighter skin tones. So, on the left-hand graph, what you see is the percentage of people who ever used a skin tone modifier, if they're doing an emoji that could be modified. And you can see, as you move right, on the bottom scale, this is a scale of actual skin tone based on sort of dermatologists' work on sensitivity to sunlight. So the scale, the Fitzgerald scale, that was the basis for the development of the skin tone emojis, had really nothing to do with emojis. It had to do with dermatology. But as you move to the right, you get higher rates of adoption. People who have ever used a modifier is much greater for people with darker skin tone than lighter skin tone. And then on the right-hand graph, you say, for people who ever did use it, what's the frequency of use? And even there, you see, yeah, people will experiment with it, use it sometimes, but they don't use it as often as people with darker skin tone. So what's going on over here? You can think about what might be driving this kind of phenomenon yourself. But one possibility is the following I want to put to you. People who are adopting the modified emoji and have themselves a darker skin tone are simply signaling their comfort with their skin tone. They're saying, look, this is who I am, this is my skin tone, I'm going to use this one instead of the Simpson's yellow. What are people with a lighter skin tone signaling when they adopt an emoji which is skin tone modified? This is a bit more ambiguous, and you've got a broad range. I'll show you, articles on this in a second, a broad range of interpretations of this particular signal, ranging from support for white nationalism to recognition of white privilege. And all of those messages, which are so different from each other, are bundled together in one particular message. And the hesitation to adopt a message that might be misunderstood could explain why people are sticking to the default with greater likelihood. However, and this I think is an important point, the meaning of the default changes once the alternative are available. So people have also been called out for using the default because they're failing to recognize their privilege. So sometimes people are criticized for using the default now that the modifier is available, because that itself involves a very different kind of decision than the use of that thumbs up emoji. So that can drive people to actually stop using the emoji altogether, right? Because there's a different inference now associated even with the default. So the point I'm trying to make over here, and I'll come back to it in a second, is that the adoption of a message which is clearer, right, will be greater than the adoption of messages that is more ambiguous, especially if the ambiguity gives you a very broad range of meaning. And you've got lots and lots of articles about this, including advice columns that are telling people, how and when to use it, what it means to other people, and so on. And a lot of this is speculative, but the last one from Wired is actually an advice column. So this is a phenomenon that has been observed, not just in the scientific literature, but in the popular press. Another example. So in 2016, right, I think many of you will remember Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders running for the Democratic nomination. But if you think back, you might also remember a third candidate, Martin O'Malley, was running for that very same nomination. And there was an occasion where he was asked a question, and he responded to it by saying, Black lives matter, white lives matter, all lives matter. So he used this phrasing while he was running for the Democratic nomination. And he was booed at the time by the audience, by some elements in the audience. He was booed for using that expression. And he was confused, and there's a video of it online. He was really quite confused as to why he's being booed. So he repeated it very, very slowly and deliberately, and then was booed again. And he was just trying to understand what was. He really was quite puzzled as to why he's being booed. 24 hours later, he apologized. Again, some of this is speculative. You don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but somebody may have alerted him to the fact that some people see all lives matter as a racist dog whistle. And so he apologized for it within 24 hours. But the apology itself caused a lot of confusion. And Jeb Bush, for example, who's running for the Republican nomination, was very, very puzzled why you would apologize for saying something as innocuous or maybe laudable as all lives matter. So again, here's a message that was interpreted in different ways by different people. And there were then again explainers to say, look, here's what the message might mean to some people, as opposed to its literal meaning. And there's lots of other examples that you could come up with. Okay, so with autonomous messages, because you can choose to adopt and abandon at will, right? There may be costs of doing it, but because you can choose to adopt and abandon, at any given point in time, there's a distribution of people who are using that signal, that are choosing to send that message. And the population of people that are choosing to send that message has an impact on its meaning. If the use of the lighter-skinned thumbs up emoji is very popular among white nationalists, that's going to give it a certain meaning. People will make that inference when they see it, which they would not make if it was an entirely different, if it was being used as an indicator of recognition of one's privilege, for example. So what the meaning does, the meaning at any point in time is going to attract some people and repel others. So some people, so think of all lives matter. If it starts to get the broadly shared meaning that it is in fact a racially coded dog whistle, a racist dog whistle, then people like Martin O'Malley and others who absolutely do not benefit from sending that message and actually may be personally distressed by the fact that they have accidentally done so, will stop. They'll abandon. Meanwhile, who will adopt? Those who, with some plausible deniability, look, all I'm saying is an innocuous statement, would like to actually send that message. In fact, they might relish sending that message. And through this process of selective adoption and abandonment, the meaning will change. And eventually, the meaning may become entrenched. And it might become entrenched in two different ways. One is what economists call a separating equilibrium, where there's a particular type of person who's using that message, and it becomes very unambiguous. Or it may be what economists call a pooling equilibrium, where multiple types of people are sending that message, and it retains some ambiguity. But you've settled into some distribution of a population that is sending that particular message. Now, this has some, this might seem quite trivial. I mean, why are we bothering with thumbs up emojis and expressions like that? It has some very serious consequences, because once a message is associated with a meaning, and there's a certain population of users, you can make an inference about who's using that message. What kind of a person would say something like this, right? Once you're reasoning in that way, people can use the signal to try to make inferences about values and commitments of the people who are sending that particular message. And people are aware of this. Now, once that process starts, and this is a process that Glenn Loury, in a very interesting paper, 1994 paper in Rationality and Society, called Self-Censorship in Public Discourse, I highly recommend this. This is what he calls an ad hominem inference. Notice that he's not saying ad hominem attack, right? It's an ad hominem inference. You are just deducing something about the values and commitments and character of a person based on what they're saying, maybe positive, maybe negative. But it's just an inference, and it's not in itself judgmental, right? You may make a judgment based on that inference, but this is what he calls an ad hominem inference. And he argues that it's vitally important defensive tactic in public discourse. Now, why is it important? And Lowry's explanation for this is, I think, it's very insightful. He says it's important because imagine somebody is saying something that you are inclined to disagree with, whether it's about the effects of the minimum wage on employment, the effects of a carbon tax on global warming, whether it's about the effects of any particular government policy, let's say, an empirical or factual claim. So they are making a claim, and that claim seems wrong to you based on your own perspective. You feel like, no, this is not right. If you believe, if you're convinced that they share your values and commitments, then you're more likely to be persuaded by them. Because you're convinced that you're seeking the same ends, and they believe that you're mistaken about how those ends can be achieved. So you will be inclined to take them seriously. You'll listen to them. You might change your mind if you believe that they share your values and commitments. If you believe, on the other hand, that they don't, in that case, you may disregard what they're saying. The reason they disagree with your empirical claim is because they have goals that are different from yours. So I don't need to change my mind about it. Right? So this kind of inference about their character affects how we evaluate their empirical statements. This is his explanation for why it matters, right? Why we do this. But once you see that, then you realize that you can get a lot of self-censorship as a result. Because if you believe something that is generally out of place in the community in which you're embedded, even if you share the values and commitments of that community, you don't want to run the risk of being thought not to share those values and commitments. Because if you make a claim that will cause people to suspect that you may not share their values and commitments, you might abstain from doing so. You might be hesitant in order to do so. And that will cause you then to suppress what you feel out of fear that you may be misunderstood, right? Or perhaps you really don't share their values and commitments, so it's important to you for that people believe that you do. In that case, again, you will censor yourself with regard to these views. Now, Lowry's work, and he mentions this, is related to a bunch of things that have similar ideas that were floated around previously. Most especially Erving Goffman's work on impression management in the presentation of self in everyday life. And I'll come back to this book later at the end of the talk. It's just a phenomenal piece of work. And, Goffman looks at human interaction as theater, essentially, I'm trying to create an impression, I'm keeping in mind how you might perceive exactly what I'm telling you, and he sees people in social interactions as actors on a stage, speaking to an audience and creating an impression in the audience. And then there's Elizabeth Noel Neumann's work on the spiral of silence, there's Timur Grant's work on preference falsification, where you can go one step further than self-censorship. You can actually disclose opinions that you don't hold, right? That is preference falsification, especially in authoritarian societies where there are strong incentives to refrain from disclosing what you believe. And then Václav Havel's insights into how small deviance from ritualistic acts can be extremely subversive, again, in authoritarian societies. Little acts of defiance by simply not doing what is ritually expected of you can be very subversive. And all of these things are of a piece with Glenn's article on self-censorship. So I think that these are important. Now, what happened after all this stuff was published? This stuff was out there by the 1990s. A couple of recent strands of literature, I think, has made these kinds of effects and interactions more important than they have ever been, right? And I'll mention two of these things. So one of them is this idea of identity protective cognition, or cultural cognition, which is developed by Dan Kahan and his colleagues at Yale, where he argues that people's beliefs about a whole range of empirical claims, whether it is the safety of nuclear reactors, or about climate change, about abortion, about minimum wages, and so on, tax policy, a whole range of issues, a whole range of important policy questions. They cohere. If you tell me your opinion on one of these issues, or two of these issues, it's quite likely that I will be able to accurately predict your positions on other issues that seem quite unrelated. And Kahan's argument is that they cohere because they stem from a particular, our parsing of evidence, our acceptance of empirical claims is itself dependent on our identity or on our political culture, ideology. Such factors affect our interpretation of data and our interpretation of claims. And what that means is that if somebody presents to us a claim with which we disagree, we are more inclined to think that they don't share our values and commitments. And so this sort of amplifies the effects that were discussed in Glenn's work. And the other is referred to as affective polarization. This is work done by political scientists over the last sort of 15 years or so, where they noticed a phenomenon that was relatively new in American political life, at least in intensity it was new. For a long time now, from going back to the 70s, we've had increasing ideological polarization. So for example, the idea that you would have Democrats who got an A rating from the NRA, which was not unknown maybe 50 years ago. It's almost impossible now. Same with issues with beliefs about abortion, immigration, and so on and so forth. You've got this much tighter correlation within political parties with regard to what people believe and what people endorse. That is ideological polarization. And affective polarization is something that is layered on top of that, which is that you not only feel that your political opponents are mistaken, you don't just think they're wrong, you think that they're despicable. So this idea that they measure it using these thermometer scales. How warm do you feel, towards Republicans? Are you a Republican? How warm do you feel towards Democrats? Are you a Democrat? And this has sort of, gone up off the charts almost since about 2012, which was the earliest paper, the paper that I'm citing over here. So affective polarization also, I think, amplifies the effects that I described earlier and increases the pressure for preference falsification and self-censorship. So these two phenomena have sort of supercharged effects that were always there, but at a more milder level. Just some little bit of data. Now, this is based on surveys that you can quite easily find flaws with, right? This is FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, does these faculty and student surveys. Very similar results appear for the students as for the faculty. They are imperfect signals in the sense that the survey response rates are low and you've got selective response. There's reason to believe that the people who respond to the surveys are not representative of the population. That said, right, with that caveat in place, I still think that they are quite useful to look at. And here you find that not only on online communications, but also in research topics investigated in academic publications, outside talks and classroom lectures, there's a fair amount of self-censorship going on among faculty at universities in the United States. And this is a very broad sample, including public, private universities, liberal arts colleges, and Ivy League, and so on. And what are the issues? Well, in the recent surveys, it's Israel-Palestine conflict is right up there at the top in terms of the topic on which you have the greatest degree of self-censorship. But issues related to race, transgender rights, affirmative action, abortion, and so on, hate speech, you've also got a fair amount of self-censorship among faculty. And then if you look at the data that they present on students, it's really very, very similar. There's self-censorship to a pretty high degree, and it is on relatively similar set of issues. Okay, let me move on to forced and defensive signals. And I'll keep an eye on the time. I don't want to go longer than an hour. I know you scheduled 2 hours, but people won't have patience. I think at some point I'll be trying your patience. Okay, so recall that I defined a forced signal as something you can't avoid sending. Markers of race, ethnicity, gender, hard to falsify. Height and build, things like that, right? Now, you can pair it with defensive signals to try to mitigate the effects of that. And this is one of the most vivid examples of a pairing of a forced and a defensive signal. This is from Brent Staples' memoir from the 1990s. And he was a graduate student at the University of Chicago studying doing a PhD in psychology. And he'd like to take walks along the lake. And especially in the evening hours, he would find that people shrank from him. His height, build, his African-American, he would find that people were just terrified of him, right, at that time and place. And, it's described here, a couple of locked arms and so on and so forth. And he tried to do all kinds, it bothered him, right? It bothered him that this happened. So here's the solution he found. He started to whistle Vivaldi and songs from the Beatles. And it completely changed the ways in which people reacted to him. And so he was able to transform the consequence of the forced signal by pairing it with a defensive signal. And this idea of whistling Vivaldi is actually used by Claude Steele in a book of his. But the origin of the phrase is from Brent Staples' memoir. So this is, for me, a very vivid example of how a defensive signal can be paired with a forced signal to mitigate the effects of the latter. The next example I'm going to present, you may be familiar with. So this is from Professor Anderson's book, Imperative of Integration. And we use this in our earlier book that Dave mentioned, the book with Dan O'Flaherty. We actually use this in the preface. And this is an example of a force signal being paired with a defensive signal. So here's an incident that is described. Driving in Detroit, oil light came on, and a young black man approached me. Don't worry, I'm not here to rob you. He said, holding up his hands, palms flat, gesturing his innocence. So this is not whistling Vivaldi, but it is something fulfilling a similar purpose. It is sending a signal to indicate that the impression caused by the force signal may be mistaken, and the pairing causes that to be mitigated. And then there's a transaction that takes place, which is beneficial for both parties, and that becomes possible because of the defensive signal being paired with the force signal. One more example. So this is Eric Holder's talk to the NAACP in 2013, the annual conference of the NAACP. He talks about talking to his 15-year-old son. There's lots and lots of articles about this from many, many people, but Eric Holder, I think, was one of the more prominent examples of this. And the idea was, look, how should you behave if you're pulled over by a cop, while you're driving or stopped as a pedestrian? And basically, the kinds of things that this entails usually take the following form: keep both hands on the steering wheel, no sharp movements, be polite and courteous, and so on and so forth. So basically instructions on how to behave in that particular interaction. Now, this is another example of how defensive signals may be paired with a force signal. Now, this is not just a phenomenon that I want to describe. I want to look at the implications of this for the interpretation of data, okay? So here is an example from a New York Times article by an outstanding economist, Sendil Munenathan. And here's what he does. He's writing about the police use of lethal force. And he looks at the percentage of arrestees that are African American, and he compares this to the percentage of victims of police shootings that are African American. He says, look, it's about 29% arrestees, it's about 32% victims of police shootings. If police discrimination were a big factor, we would have expected a larger gap between the arrest rate and the police killing rate. This suggests that removing police racial bias will have little effect on the killing rate. What he's assuming here, right, is that there's no defensive signal involved, because that would completely change the nature of the encounter. The likelihood that an encounter would move in a particular direction depends on whether or not a defensive signal is used. And so, you cannot just look at this kind of data and make what seems like an intuitive and obvious inference, because the nature of the interaction is changed completely by the fact that forced and defensive signals are implicated. For example, suppose that a neighbor calls the cops, and this happened, for example, with the Gates arrest in Boston, under certain circumstances based on, let's say, the race of the person who's being observed, in this case, Bill Gates. Not Bill Gates, sorry, Skip Gates in Boston. Something similar happened also with the shooting of Tamir Rice in Ohio. But you have to think about the denominator. The total number of arrests could be inflated by the fact that you have got forced signals going on. And so you're not, you don't have the right baseline. You may have arrests of a whole bunch of people that pose no threat to the officers. And if you include that in your baseline of arrests, you're going to make an invalid inference. But more relevant to the issues I raised in a couple of slides, the previous slides, the defensive signals also have an impact. Right? That's going to affect how interactions play out. And if you ignore that, you're not making a logically valid inference. Now, he may be right or he may not be right, right? I mean, I've looked at police use of force for a long time, and it's covered extensively in my book, and there's lots of puzzles, and it's poorly understood. Don't, if you think you know what's going on with that, you probably want to dig a little bit deeper, right? There's a huge amount of geographic variation. You're more likely to be killed by police if you're white in Phoenix than if you're black in New York City, for example. There are lots of puzzles and things about police use of force extremely high in the west of the United States. States like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, even compared to the New England, has much, much lower rates. So there are all kinds of patterns in the data that call for interpretation. So I don't want to make a case about that. For that, I would refer you to my earlier book. But the basic point is that encounters between strangers are not They're not qualitatively similar once you realize that forced and defensive signals are involved. All right? And just very briefly, this is the book that Dave mentioned with Dan O'Flaherty. This is everywhere. In interactions involving people in the criminal justice system, victims and offenders, officers and suspects, jurors and defendants, judges making bail decisions, officers and, prosecutors and witnesses. All of these interactions involve strangers. They don't know each other very well. And so, stereotypes, which are a category of force signal, come into play, and they can be bundled with defensive signals. And really, without really fully accounting for these things, you're not going to make valid inferences from data. So I just mentioned that. I won't say more about it because it's in the earlier book. But I'll mention one other very interesting example of a defensive signal, a forced and defensive signal. And this is discussed by Tracy McMillan Cotton in her book Thick, and also Kerwin Charles, Hurst, and Rusanoff in a very good paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And this has to do with conspicuous consumption. So conspicuous consumption is a term that's associated with Thorsten Veblen, his book Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899. He used the term to refer to people who were very affluent and flaunting their affluence. He used it that they were trying to signal their wealth in ways that were, very public. But this is sort of turned on its head by some of the analysis of Kerwin Charles. Kerwin Charles makes the argument that if you belong to a group, and there's something similar in Tracy McMillan Cotton's book of essays as well. If you belong to a group that has relatively low income in any particular community, so you think of a community that is stratified and you belong, recognizably, as a force signal, you belong to a community that is going to be stereotyped as having low income, maybe low education, you might engage in conspicuous consumption, separate yourself from that stereotype. So you're bundling the conspicuous consumption, the clothes you wear, the hats, the shoes, the accessories might be chosen. They may be expensive. It may be hard for you to afford, but it allows you to mitigate the effects of being perceived to be of low income. And what's wonderful about that paper by Kerwin Charles, and I've talked to him about this, although the title is Conspicuous Consumption and Race, it's a non-racial theory of conspicuous consumption. There are communities in which you have got, whites having lower income maybe than other groups in that community, and they will engage in this exact same kind of practices. So it's really not a cultural theory at all. It's really based on the incentive for bundling a forced signal with a defensive signal. Okay, let me go to the interpretation of prices. Oh, gosh. I went way too fast. I wanted to talk a little bit before I stop about prediction markets, so let me. Okay. Yeah, maybe I will not get to the merit part, but I'll give you a bit of a preview. Okay, I really do want to cover the part about prices. So I'm going to pair this thing because I'll talk about prices in what I call prediction markets. This is another thing that I've been studying quite a bit recently. All right. So, prices have been looked at, for millennia. I mean, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and others have written about the justice of prices, whether prices are fair or whether they're not fair. But it is really with Adam Smith that you start having an interpretation of prices in terms of the free movement of people across occupations and the free movement of capital across sectors. So once you have this kind of movement, you start to get ideas of a uniform rate of profit or compensating wage differentials. And in that situation, you can attach an interpretation to prices that is new on the scene. This is Adam Smith. And so Adam Smith, talked about natural and market prices, and he talked about prices, really the natural price of a commodity as being the price that would exactly cover the natural rates of wages, profits, and rents that were required in order to bring it to the market. And he used Adam Smith's writing is absolutely beautiful. Liz and I were discussing it earlier. And he talks about what he calls what has come to be called the water diamond paradox. He says, look, we can't live without water. We can certainly, most of us at least, live without diamonds. Why are diamonds so much more expensive than water? It's precisely because the costs of procuring them and bringing them to market are higher. If water cost as much as diamonds, you'd have market flooded with water. And this explains why water, it's just less costly to produce and bring to market than diamonds are. But it was really Hayek in his 1945 paper that really centered the informational content of prices and the idea of prices as conveying messages, right? And I'm not going to go through this whole passage. It's very long. This itself is a truncated version of a very long passage about the price of tin. But let me just tell you roughly what he's saying here. he basically imagines that some use for tin has arisen or that some source of supply has become constrained. And he says it doesn't matter which of these things has happened. And here's the line I've highlighted. It is very significant that it does not matter. It really doesn't matter whether you know why the price of tin has gone up. Could be some mines have closed down, could be a war somewhere, it could be because some use of tin has emerged that was not there previously. But the fact that the price of tin has gone up gives precisely the right amount of information to people for them to economize on the use of tin, right? It provides them an incentive to do so, and it basically tells them, look, you better use less tin. But not only that, it also has repercussions for people who use substitutes of tin, and substitutes of those substitutes, and so on and so forth. So it echoes, it sort of reverberates throughout the society, and you've got these prices doing this job of conveying, in a very compact form, information that, were it known to everybody else, would lead to adjustments. And all that other information is unnecessary because the price is conveying what's needed in a very compact way. And he has this very nice expression: the whole acts as one market, not because any of its members survey the whole field, but because their limited individual fields of vision sufficiently overlap so that through many intermediaries, the relevant information is communicated to all. Okay, so he's got this, Hayek saw the market mechanism as being miraculous and was one of its biggest champions, right? We know that. But think about this for a second. If prices are messages, if prices carry information, unless that information is instantaneously transmitted into prices, then price movements will be informative. And if price movements are informative, then price movements will be predictive. And if price movements are predictive, they will lead to actions that could be extremely profitable, but will also lead to other price movements. So you see the price of tin moving up and you say, oh my gosh, something is getting started, right? And you massively buy up tin, and you manage to do it before the real adjustment has taken place, you stand to make a lot of money. So if prices are informative and price movements are informative, people are going to be trying to extract information from price movements. And this is what some traders have been doing throughout history, but which algorithms and artificial intelligence is doing at a very rapid scale right now. So basically, if you think about trading, if you think about asset prices, financial markets and asset prices, there are really two kinds of trading strategies. There are others, but I want to just focus on two. There are those that look at the price and compare it to what it should be based on the profitability of a company or the likelihood of a debtor paying, let's say the government of Greece paying its debt. And if the price is too low, they buy. If its price is too high, they sell or find other ways to bet that the price will go down. And this is what might be called a strategy that is based on fundamentals. You're looking at the price and seeing, is this price right based on what I know about the world? And trading based on kind of evaluation injects information into the market, right? Because your information, your research, it comes to be reflected in the market in a way that Hayek actually imagined. But that's costly and time-consuming and takes effort. Perhaps you can actually extract that information. Once it starts to be incorporated by the market, maybe you can extract it from the prices itself. Maybe market data itself can give you that information at a much lower cost. And that's a very different type of trading strategy that is referred to in the finance literature as a technical trading strategy. You're not really looking at the world. You're looking at, the price is moving in this way. Can I make an inference from the price movement itself? And if there's too many people making, trying to extract information from market data itself, you can get things like this. So this was on May 6th of 2010, where you had a 10% decline in the stock market. There was $1 trillion lost, and that's worth even more now at today's prices. And then it recovered, very, very quickly. It's just an 8-minute episode where you had companies like Accenture that are trading, for $20, $30 a share, and then suddenly start trading, actual trading for 1 penny a share. There were actual transactions involved at a penny a share. You have shares like Sotheby's trading for $20, $30, $40 a share. Suddenly there are trades actually at, I think, $99,000 a share. I mean, the volatility was just incredible. So what's going on is, it was algorithms trying to, and this is way before AI, trying to extract information from prices and seeing that downward decline as somehow informative about further downward declines, and then feeding on itself and reaching levels that were really, completely, anybody who knew anything about the world would say this is not a correct price. In fact, there's a hilarious clip, and you can find this online, of CNBC watching this in real time, and they're watching the price of Procter & Gamble. And it started off the day, so I don't know if you can see it, but really if you look carefully on the top graph and you look at this, $62.60, that was the closing price from the previous day. So the price had fallen from $62 to $42.50, which is about you can see there, it's about 30% decline in price. It fell from above 60 down to about 42, right? And this was being watched in real time, and Jim Cramer, you may be familiar with, commentator on these markets, was watching this decline, and he started to just yell at the screen. And he was saying, that's not a real price, and that's at 42, that's not at 1 cent, right? That's at 42, that is not a real price, all right? Buy it. If I had a hedge fund, I'd buy 50,000 shares of this right away, okay? And within a minute, it was back up to 62, exactly where it had started. So, the sort of strategy that Cramer is describing over here is what I said was a fundamental strategy. You look at the world, you know how much profit Procter & Gamble is making, you have some idea of what the shares should be worth, and 42 is just a steal. It's a steal. But not everybody would know it. I wouldn't know it, actually. I would have said 42, oh, something happened to Procter & Gamble. But, he's watching all this happen, and that knowledge then caused that reversal to occur. You find the same thing. I'm going to skip through some of it, but you find the same kind of phenomenon. This is the interest rate that was paid by Greece. This was the Greek debt crisis in 2011, where they're paying the same interest rates for borrowing. This is the Greek government. This is borrowing in euros. They're borrowing the same currency. They're paying the same interest rate as Germany, and then it shoots up to 35% interest rate, in the matter of a few months, because of fears of default by Germany, and a country that can sustainably pay a 5% interest rate indefinitely cannot possibly pay its debt if it has to pay 35% to refinance it. I mean, the American government, the treasury bonds and bills that the US government issues in order to borrow to finance its deficit are considered some of the safest assets in the world. Why are they considered safe? Not because people believe that taxes will exceed government expenditures when those debts come due. Not at all, they won't. We haven't had a government budget surplus for over 20 years. They know that there'll be a government budget deficit next year when those bills and bonds come due. The reason why they're considered safe is because people are completely confident that the government will be able to borrow at low interest rates when the time comes for it to pay its old debt. They are completely confident that it will be able to refinance its debt, roll over its debt, right, as needed, over and over and over again. This is what the government does, and this is what people expect it will do. With the Greek case, that confidence got broken. And once it gets broken, that can become itself a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the end, Greek did not, well, it did have a partial default, and then a bailout, and a combination of those two things then brought it back down in that earlier graph. And you get similar things happening in exchange rate markets. This is before the euro. The British pound got knocked out of the European exchange rate mechanism very, very suddenly and quickly. The British government could not defend it because the belief that it would stay in there got shattered, that confidence that it would stay in the European exchange rate mechanism, and then that belief then became self-fulfilling, okay? All right, let me talk about prediction markets, and then I think I'll stop. So this is the last thing I'll talk about, and I'll briefly mention something about merit, and then I'll stop because I don't want to take too much time. I'd much rather have questions than hear your responses. So prediction markets have become big. They've been around for about 40 years, online prediction markets. I'll tell you exactly how they are, what they are and how they work in a second. But in the last couple of years, through basically Polymarket and Kalshi that you see on the screen, they have become, multi-billion-dollar industries, rapidly growing with very, very high valuations for these companies. Now, what's a prediction market? It's just a financial market, right? So some of the things that I explained earlier about financial markets also apply to prediction markets. But they're financial markets which involve trading of a very simple kind of assets. It's not stocks in a company. It's not bonds issued by a borrower. It is a very simple asset that will pay you a fixed amount if an event occurs, a referenced event occurs, and nothing otherwise. All right? And the best way to see this is with an example. So this is from a couple of weeks ago. This is for a contract that will pay you $1, and this is traded in the millions. So, but each contract is just saying, I'll pay you, you'll be paid $1 if the referenced event occurs. And the referenced event here is which party will win the US House of Representatives in the November elections of this year. And at the price at last trade at that time was 78 cents. It's up to about 83 cents right now, right, over the past couple of weeks, partly due to what's going on in the Middle East. But a couple of weeks ago, it was 78 cents. Now, what does that mean? That means that somebody was able to buy a contract for 78 cents that would pay them $1 if the Democrats win the election in 2026, if they regain control of the House, and nothing if they lose. So it's quite risky, right? But how does this actually work? So, let me just show you the mechanics of the process by which this works. Because you can't buy for 78 cents a contract that will pay you $1 if Democrats win, unless somebody somewhere is willing to buy for 22 cents a contract that would pay them $1 if they don't win, right? That's how prediction markets work, right? So the center, the heart of the prediction market is something called an order book, and this is also at the heart of a stock exchange, also at the heart of a derivatives exchange like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. But this is how it works. So basically, this was an order book at the time, this is a couple of weeks ago now. If you want to buy, so you can see the 78 cents over here. If you want to buy a contract at 78 cents that will pay you $1 if the Democrats win, you can do that. And there are about 400,000 such contracts available at that time. So you could do that. That'll cost you about what, something around $300,000, and you'll get 400,000 if they win. You could buy up all of those contracts. These contracts are available for you to buy. Okay? If you don't want to buy at 78, you prefer to buy at 77 or 76 or 75, you can submit that order. Right? You can do that. But it won't trade because there's no, the best available price is 78. So if you submit at 77, let's say I want to buy 100 contracts at 77, then it would go into the order book. So this number would go up by 100. Right? There would be more orders now available for other people to trade against, but you wouldn't get your shares. You might get them at some later time, right? It could be that trades, right? But what if you submit an order to buy 100 shares at 78? What happens? Notice that this number, 395,000, is identical to this number here. All right? And what that means is that people previously, before you submitted your order for 78, previously a whole bunch of people had submitted orders to buy the no side of that contract, the Democrats will not win, for 22 cents. And so these orders were sitting there, waiting to trade. And when you bought at 78, you took some of them. They were available to you. So basically what the exchange is doing, exchange is not a bookmaker. They don't take any position. They're not taking any risk, in fact. What they're doing is they're matching people who want to bet that an event will occur with people who want to bet that it won't. All right? And in this case, somebody who's willing to pay 22 cents to bet that Democrats won't win is being matched with somebody who will pay 78 cents for a contract that Democrats will win. Exchange takes the dollar, 78 from one, 22 from the other, and holds on to it. And if Democrats win, they pay one. If they lose, they pay the other. That's how it works. Right? That's how a prediction market works. Okay. Now, I talked over lunch with a bunch of very impressive students from your PPE program about these markets, are they good or bad? And the discussion about these things is incredibly polarized. There are people who think best things in sliced bread because they forecast better than alternatives. There are others who think it's the devil's playground and it's just a really, truly awful thing in society. And I want to show you why both of those things have merit. I mean, that one needs to think about both the pros and the cons, really, about these things. So this is 3 days before Biden dropped out in 2024. Dropped out as a presumed Democratic nominee. He decided he's not going to run for re-election. This was 18th of July, 2024. And at that time, according to prediction market, this is a different market, poly market, Biden's likelihood of winning the presidency had already dropped to 4.5%. Right? This is 3 days before he dropped out. And Harris, at this time, you can see her likelihood of winning the presidency was up to above 22%. This is according to the prediction markets. Okay, when you're talking about accuracy of prediction, you've got to say accuracy compared to what? And we can compare it with statistical forecasts of election outcomes. There are many of these. Nate Silver has one. You may have heard of him. The Economist has a presidential forecast model. The 538, which was then owned by ABC News, was generating a forecast. So you had statistical predictions of the presidential election outcome. And right up until Biden dropped out, they were giving zero likelihood to anyone other than Trump or Biden winning, right? Why was that? Because the way the models work is they basically operate on the assumption that history is a good guide to the future. And the data that they're using, which was calibrated on previous elections, was using opinion poll data. And opinion poll data was all Trump versus Biden. That's all they could do. And they knew that something is wrong with this, right? But that was the only alternative that they had. So right up until the point that Biden dropped out, they were giving a forecast for Trump versus Biden, but they couldn't give anything to Harris because that was not being tested by the opinion poll data. They just didn't have that as an input. And so when Biden did drop out, they just took these things offline. So all the models were suspended, right? And you can see that, you can see here that they were suspended. They waited for new data to come in, recalibrated. Maybe history is now a good guide to the future, and they came back online, right? So this is where the markets can have some strength. And I think that forecasting elections is not all that socially important accurately, but what's really important is forecasting the spread of a disease. Flu season, certainly during the pandemic, and you had models that were generally based on epidemiological concerns, models that were presenting predictions to the CDC about what's going to happen 1 week out, cases, hospitalizations, deaths from COVID, and the models disagreed with each other by a factor of 100 to 1. They were just completely all over the place. And then week to week, they disagreed with themselves. So there was a huge amount of variation in these models. Small changes in assumptions gave you huge changes in forecasts. And they couldn't take into account, the models could take into account, certain epidemiological factors, the SIR model, the population that is susceptible, infected, recovered, the basic bread and butter of an epidemiological model was there and embellished in various ways. But, a statement by opening of the beaches in Florida, closing of them in California, lockdowns in Illinois, so on and so forth, school closures, those things couldn't be modeled by these models, and markets could potentially add value for these kind of events. Of course, that's not what they're doing. They're mostly on sports. They're mostly on very frivolous things, and sometimes on geopolitical violence and so on, right? So they're not there's plenty to criticize about these markets, but there is a potential there, right, that I don't want us to lose sight of. Now, I want to give you one example. Oh gosh, I've already gone for an hour, but we started a bit late, right? Give me 5 minutes, yeah, and then I'll skip the last one. Okay, I want to show you something that I think is quite telling. So here's the 2020. So now go back to 2020, the Biden-Trump race that Biden won in 2020. So this is November 3rd, the election was called. The election was held. November 7th it was called, and November 23rd, the transition to the new administration began. There's an official sort of process of transition that began. Okay. Here's what prediction markets, this was a different one. This is predicted. Kalshi and Polymarket were not around at that time. They were giving a double-digit likelihood that this is on the 29th of November, after the beginning of a transition, giving double-digit likelihood that Trump would be re-elected. This is like almost a month after the election. And this made absolutely no sense to people. And here's Nate Silver on social media saying that, look, basically, if you think Trump will win, you deserve to lose your money, he says. He says, some people are idiots and some idiots bet on prediction markets. I mean, you can just look at this thing. I mean, this is not just Nate Silver. Many people who were in the election forecasting space were basically saying that people are just throwing away their money. What kind of fools are these, right? Buying double-digit probabilities with regard to Trump. Once you look at it from hindsight of January 6th, right, you see that the markets are revealing something that may have been hidden from most of us, right? That there's something afoot, right? If you instead of dismissing entirely the foolishness of traders, if one were to go back and think about this with hindsight, that people are thinking about avenues for this market to resolve in a way that actually gets them paid. Now, With this particular prediction market, in early December, they settled the market. They declared Biden as the victor, and they paid the people who had bet on Biden to win the election. So those people who were betting on Trump over here lost their money. They did lose their money. However, there were a whole bunch of markets on cabinet positions. You know, who would be Secretary of State, who would be, you know, Secretary of the Treasury, and so on and so forth. Lots and lots of these markets. And they also had double-digit probabilities for the incumbents to stay, Pompeo to stay, you know, Mnuchin to stay in these positions, right? And they were referencing events, who will be Treasury Secretary March 15th of 2021. Those markets couldn't be settled. Just because Trump lost the election, you can't settle you can't say who's going to be Treasury Secretary on March 15th. So those markets remained open. And they continued to trade at those levels. And when January 6th happened, the people who had bet that Pompeo would stay as Treasury Secretary for a period of time, those prices jumped up. So they would have then been able to cash out at a significant profit. So sometimes markets serve this purpose, and you know, one needs to be attentive to it, I would say. And you know, you see headlines like this very, very often, you know, about the possibilities of historically unprecedented interference in the November midterms. And if I start to see a mismatch between what the markets are saying and what the statistical models and the opinion polls are saying, you know, my first instinct, rather than to say that traders are foolish, would be to say, look, what information am I not seeing that might be dispersed somewhere and hidden? Let me finish, I think, with this. Okay, let me finish. Let me finish with this. There's something that I call a prediction market paradox. So now we go to the negatives of prediction markets. You know, so I've given you a reason why they may serve a socially useful function in potential. However, think about the following. With elections, the beliefs about who is going to win can actually affect who wins, right? There's this feedback effect between subjective and objective probabilities. There's, you know, optimism can feed on itself. For example, if a candidate is losing momentum, if their price drops on a prediction market substantially and it looks like they're flagging, their campaign is flagging, morale is going to go down, fundraising is going to go down, who's going to, you know, bet on this person, you know, who's going to donate to their campaign, volunteer effort will go down, turnout will go down, right, if you're in the early voting period, for example. And so, you know, optimism and pessimism can both be self-fulfilling in these kind of situations. And in that case, if people believe that a market is a good forecasting mechanism, right, if they take the prices seriously as a measure of, as a probability, then the incentives to manipulate the market by changing the price are the strongest. You can, you know, and it doesn't cost that much, right? A few $1 million, less than it would cost to construct and air an ad in prime time, right? Can be used to move the price of on the market by a few cents here and there, right? Or put a floor on the price, prevent it from falling too far, too fast. So a market that is believed to be completely accurate and free of manipulation is the one that people will want to manipulate the most. On the other hand, if it's a market that is thought to be routinely manipulated and people don't take the price seriously, there's no point in manipulating it. So this is what I refer to as prediction market paradox. There'll be some manipulation, but it can't be too much to destroy the market's credibility. So let me close with evidence on manipulation. And this is a tweet, this is something, when it was still called Twitter, I put out on 3:30 p.m. on election day on 2012. I've shown you what an order book looks like. This is the order book on Romney versus Obama race, 2012, on 3:30 p.m. on election day. And I noticed that the orders on the buy side, people buying Romney to win, those orders were very large at various prices that were staggered from 30 cents on down. And it looked to me like somebody's trying to make sure that the price of the Romney contract doesn't drop below 30. Right? Possibly to make sure that people go to the polls and they don't give up hope and whatever it might be, right? And so I posted this, and then it got picked up by a couple of people and spread around, whatever it is. And then you know, that election was over. It was called quite quickly. That was the Obama-Romney race. But then, along with David Rothschild, we got our hands on actual transaction-level data from this particular market. This market was called Intrade at that time. And if you look at Trader B, it was there was somebody who engaged in 22,000 trades and bought 2 million contracts for Romney to win, and bet a total of $7 million overall and lost it all because it was, because that was the outcome of the election. So this was all one single account because we had account level data. We don't know who it was, but we can trace that particular account level data. And this is, I have never had a paper attract this much media attention, right? People trying to figure out who is this person who's doing this kind of thing. But my point over here is that the incentives to do it are strong if people take the market seriously. So, they are not neither, innovations that are going to vastly improve our ability to forecast, although they can do some of that. But they also have certain pitfalls, and I've talked about one of them. There are others that I won't get through. Okay, I'm going to skip through this, but I just want to briefly mention that the meaning that we attach to particular measures of what are called merit, like standardized test scores, are hugely consequential right now. Let me just skip to this. So I just talked about the history of the idea of merit and so on. But this is a presidential memorandum and a deal with Columbia University that the current administration struck. And basically what they're asking for, insisting on what they call merit-based admissions, asking for data on test scores by different demographic groups, on not only on admission, not only on applicants and people who are accepted, but also on enrolled, people who are enrolled and looking at their performance while enrolled. And this is based on a very particular, very narrow conception of merit, where if you find differences across groups in acceptance rates based on applications, or you find differences in performance in class based on enrollment, the administration is likely to find Columbia in default of the agreement with them. So this is how you interpret merit is extremely consequential for what's going to play out for universities with regard to the administration. And I just, I will make these slides public in case you want to take a look, but I'm just going to skip through them. There's very interesting data that this narrow conception of merit doesn't really capture what we think of as merit, even in the narrowest sense, as performance. In the narrowest sense, merit as performance. There's a remarkable finding from a paper that I saw a few years ago when Ursina Scheder was on the job market from Zurich, but it is now forthcoming in the American Economic Review. And they find that, a gender quota in Finland, which favored men, Finland has the best K-12 education system, or one of the best in the world. But it's very competitive. There's a 10% acceptance rate for people who want to do the program to become certified teachers. And they had a 40% quota for men because there was, underrepresentation of men in this quota. And they removed it. I think it was in the 1990s. They removed it and said, why are we favoring men over here? But the removal of that quota, it turned out, actually hurt students. The students who were exposed to higher share of male quota teachers, right, prior to the removal of quota, actually ended up with higher educational attainment and labor force attachment at age 25, because this happened a long time ago. They traced those people. And this was very, very puzzling. They thought, oh, maybe it's a role model effect, maybe it's good for boys. But no, it was good for boys and girls both. They thought maybe it's a diversity effect, that maybe you need both men and women in the school, and that has some benefits. But no, the quota admitted men were enhancing the benefits for the students, even in schools where, regardless of what the initial gender composition was in those schools. So this is a huge puzzle, but it's picking up things that are unobserved, right? There are certain characteristics that were not in the application that a pure score-based admissions policy was failing to capture. And I can talk more about this later, but there's work from Dartmouth. Dartmouth was finding, Dartmouth moved to a test required policy from test optional on the grounds that people who were applying from schools with low overall test scores, but themselves had fairly high test scores, were refusing to disclose those scores. And Dartmouth was using not just the actual score, but the score, your score relative to the distribution of scores from the school on which you're applying. This can be defended on meritocratic grounds, right? On narrow meritocratic grounds. But the presidential order and the deal with Columbia would preclude this kind of admissions policy. So, I just skimming through now because I want to stop soon, but this has some important implications. I also want to briefly mention Scott's work on merit as being really a property of teams. Most of what we do is produced collectively, and you can't, merit doesn't reside in most important walks of life in the individual. It really resides in a team, and your value to the team depends on who else is in the team. So you can't really rank people individually based on merit. And Scott's book, you can see here that it's been published as a Princeton classic, republished, from his old. This is the new edition. Okay, last thing I want to say about us in higher education. So let me just finish with this. I think that what the administration's doing with regard to higher education is wrong-headed in a number of ways. I mean, it is destructive to one of the economically vibrant sectors of our economy. We are responsible for exports, produce something that is in strong global demand. It contributes to our balance of payments, contributes to innovation and all kinds of things. And in particular, I focused here on the ability to modify the ways in which the selection processes operate in these things. However, I want to also just flag something, which is that trust in higher education, views of higher education have become very negative, not just among Republicans, but also among Democrats. And this is something that universities are going to have to confront. And part of the problem does have to do with their admissions policies, right? So on the one hand, I believe that the kinds of ways in which the administration is trying to control the processes of selection, both for hiring and for admissions, are wrong-handed in a variety of ways. At the same time, universities have got to deal with this issue because this makes them very, very weak, and few people are going to be able to defend them. And this is just something that is from a quote from a book by Bowen and Bock, presidents of Princeton and Harvard, from the late 90s. And they say, look, the freedom to exercise judgment in choosing candidates on the basis of criteria beyond the usual measures of earlier academic accomplishment, which is what universities want to do. That's what enrollment, that's what their holistic admissions policies entails. It carries an obligation to monitor the results of the admissions process, graduation rates, academic performance, and subsequent contributions to society. We're not doing that and making a case to the public that the selection policies actually do match those measured future outcomes, and without that, the trust is going to keep falling. So I think this is a double-edged sword right now. We are vulnerable for reasons that are easy to understand. Okay, I'll skip this. This is the old mission of Columbia University. So in this book, I'm trying to make a case that one should have very clearly articulated and transparent policies that are connect those choices to mission-aligned goals. And here's the old mission at Columbia, if you can read the very last line over there. So sometimes people at Columbia, have been there for decades and not noticed that the mission is stated right in that last line, it's for the advancement of the public good and the glory of Almighty God. And this is an archaic message, mission. Probably the actual mission statement now will be different from this, less religious in its connotation, but it's beyond just classroom performance, And so those need to be carefully articulated and connected to admissions and hiring. Otherwise, that trust is going to just not recover. And finally, this is my last slide. I was asked a few years ago about 5 books that I thought every graduate student should read, and maybe even undergrads who are interested in social science and thinking about this. And I put this up here because of Professor Anderson's book is in there. This is from a few years ago. It wasn't because I was planning. I was invited to give this lecture, but those are the others. And I mentioned Goffman. I've mentioned Lowry. I haven't mentioned Hirschman and Schelling, but they're definitely continuously influenced my thinking and continue to do so. So thank you very much. No, I can, yeah.
Okay. All right. So we have 2 microphones there, and anyone who has a question, Professor Sethi can go up. Rush through the slides. Looks like. a frequent thing in this amphitheater is that after a couple minutes, somebody decides I'm going to be the first person. So who's the first person?
Is this on? Yeah. I was curious, I don't know a ton about the reliability of different prediction markets, but I'm curious how much variation there is in the reliability, because I have to imagine that there are certain kinds of prediction markets where if they're fulfilling the function that you're talking about, where people are bringing out hidden information, the people who are most likely to have that hidden information might also be the most biased. So like the example I think of is like sports. So, if I follow Philadelphia 76ers very, very carefully, I'm going to be able to make a much better prediction than the kind of casual NBA fan about how they're going to play the Pistons. But the only reason I know so much about the Sixers is because I'm sick, and so I don't have a good relationship to that team, and I follow them, and I want them to do well beyond what I should believe. And so I'm going to be susceptible to certain forms of bias, like wishful thinking. And so I'm curious if there's this kind of paradox where you get this pairing of the only people who are going to be informed are also going to be biased.
Two actually great questions. One is about, the performance of different prediction markets. That's what you first started with, I think. And the second is about the bias of traders. Now, the original idea of the wisdom of crowds, going back to Francis Galton's experiments with the weight of an ox, they found that there was an ox in a fairground, and people were asked to guess the weight, and they were just way off. I mean, it was like ridiculous weights that people were submitting, but the median was almost exactly right. And so it's possible for you to have lots of big biases and still have a price, because you may have biases in the other direction, and they may to some extent cancel each other out. And in the transaction level data that I looked at with David Rothschild, about 87% of people betting on the Obama-Romney race never once changed their position, no matter what information was emerging in the economy. They're just always Obama or always Romney, right? So they were exactly how you're describing. But there were about 5% that were flipping, depending on whether they saw the biases as tilting the market one way or versus the other. They're trying to exploit exactly the biases. And it's the interaction of, firstly, the dispersion of the biases, pro and con, coupled with the fact that there are people who are trying to actually look for the fact that for those biases that can increase trading accuracy. Now, there's one thing I didn't mention, which I also think comes out of your point about bias. Any market which starts to be occupied by a group of traders that are tilted towards one side or the other, whether it's about the 76ers or whether it's about an election outcome, attracts people who believe the exact opposite, because they see a profit opportunity. Imagine that the midterm market over here was completely full of people who were biased and had, through wishful thinking, wanted the Democrats to win. In that case, Republicans would see a big profit opportunity, 22 cents, yeah, I'm going to come in and buy. And prediction markets are unique. I don't want to sound like some sort of prediction market evangelist. I'm not, actually. I just want to analyze them dispassionately, but they are unique among online platforms to be anti-echo chambers by design. If it becomes an echo chamber, the price looks very attractive to people who are outside that echo chamber. And so you're going to get this kind of balancing as well. Now, the other question, which is extremely interesting, how do you tell which market is better than another market? You really can't. It's extremely difficult for the following reason. The markets are going to move in sync, like perfectly synchronized dancers. It doesn't matter which market the information arrives at. It's going to flow almost instantaneously across all other markets referencing the same event. Why is that? Imagine that a market has got Democrats to win at 70, and there's another market out there that has Democrats to win at 80, right? So there's this mismatch between these two markets. In that case, the market which has Democrats as 20 has at 80 has Republicans at 20, Democrats to not win at 20. Remember how I said how the trades occur. So I can buy Democrats to win at 70. I can buy Democrats to not win at 20, and I'm buying $1 for 90 cents. And because of this, the activity, cross-market, what's called cross-market arbitrage, these prices just can't stay away from each other. So it doesn't matter where the information enters, it's going to flow across all markets. So it makes the question of evaluating which market is more accurate hard. Not impossible. I'm trying to do that, answer that question also for Kalshi and Polymarket. There's ways to do it, but it's not easy because markets are just not going to be that far apart from each other. Otherwise, there's a lot of money to be made by taking positions on both of them.
Thank you.
Your fourth category was abstract, I think. I wonder if you could just take a minute and explain that a little more and maybe give a couple examples.
So the two examples that I am looking at deeply are prices in markets. So these are disembodied signals. So these are not signals that any individual is choosing to send. They're coming out of a process of, so in the financial market, they're coming out of a process of people submitting orders. So, people are, large numbers of people are submitting orders to buy or sell, take this position or that position. The price emerges from that process. Similarly to the discussion of Adam Smith and Hayek, and that price, the idea of a price as a message, the price as a signal, is valuable. It's a carrier of information, but I call it an abstract signal because, unlike the thumbs up emoji, nobody's actually choosing to send it. Now, sometimes people will decide, okay, I'm going to raise the price of this item on my menu. In that case, it's a deliberate act, but in that case, also the information content is quite transparent. But the price is one example of an abstract signal. The second example, which I had to rush through, unfortunately, I didn't have to, but I chose to, is a standardized test score. A standardized test score, now in that case, people can choose whether to transmit or not, but they don't have a choice. You cannot say, okay, I think today I'm going to have a test score of this, right? It's coming out of a more complex process. You may wish to have a particular score. Unlike the thumbs up emoji, you can't adopt and abandon a score at will. You can study, but you can't actually determine that score individually. That's what I also consider to be an abstract signal.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. I was wondering, I think you gave this analogy for like stock market trading and how there's like fundamental investors and then technical ones. And I wanted to kind of relate that to prediction markets, as I think they're a lot more nascent of a market that's coming. But if, a similar dynamic happens where right now I think most people on prediction markets are purely betting on the contract, if you get this influx of technical traders, I was wondering, will you see a similar trend of like market dislocations? And then because of that, I guess I'm questioning the accuracy of these prediction markets if, they're fundable to that same kind of dislocation that we might see.
Great questions. So firstly, the technical traders who are trying to extract information from the market price is already there in prediction markets in a big way. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So ahead of the capture of Maduro in Venezuela, there was somebody who bet heavily on the exact timing of that capture, made $400,000 overnight, right? Ahead of strikes on Iran, right, February 28th, on the exact timing of that, there were 5 traders on Polymarket. They made 1.2 million overnight, right? They got it exactly right. And so this looked very much like leakage inside information, somebody who's connected to the major decision makers. And there are 2 people under arrest right now in Israel, one IDF reservist and one civilian who have been charged with trading on inside information. So inside information, I know this is not what you asked for technical, but inside information has become very profitable on these prediction markets because they're referencing these kind of geopolitical events, and there are some people who really know what's going to happen. Same with tariffs and so on, right? Now, in response to that, you have got tools that people have developed. One of them is called Insider Finder that looks at whether or not somebody's trading pattern suggests a really heavy bet that could stand to lose a lot of money, and it looks like they have some inside information. And people look for that, and then they jump on that. Right? They jump on that. So what they're trying to do in that case is trying to piggyback on the inside information. So the insider is going to make a lot of money. Let me just copy the insider before the event occurs and try to see if I can spot them in the market data. This is a very, very active trading strategy right now in prediction markets, right? But then this gives rise to a third category that I didn't discuss, which is called spoofing, which is to try to act in ways that make other people think that you're an insider. very confident bet that this is going to happen in like 6 hours. It gets picked up by these folks looking for insiders. They publicize it on social media. People jump on that. Price is driven up because they think that you got inside information. You cash out, and you had no inside information at all. You're just triggering the folks who are looking for people who have inside information and mimicking their behavior. So all of this happens also on financial markets. But regulated financial markets, all of it is illegal and subject to very heavy penalties. Insider trading, you can't do. Spoofing, you can't do. And a whole bunch of other stuff is just prohibited. And the reason why people actually don't do it that much is because regulated financial markets have something called a KYC, know your customer requirement, right? And Polymarket, being a crypto-based exchange, doesn't know who's trading on their platform. All the 5 wallets that made 1.2 million on the trade on the Iran bombing could have been the same person. They could have had 5 different crypto wallets. There's no way of knowing. The exchange itself doesn't know. And so one of the arguments I've been trying to make actually the last few weeks is that this KYC requirement needs to be implemented, but how you're going to do it on a crypto-based exchange is not that easy. There are ideas out there, but yeah. But basically what you're saying could happen on the exchanges is precisely what is happening, in fact. Regarding accuracy, yes, again, you're right, because on the headline market last year, the market for who's going to win the presidency, the market forecast turned out to be more accurate than the models. But as you go down ballot, no, it was not. Because markets sometimes overreact to information. They do things like you have described over here. That gives you volatility in these markets. And the models, statistical models, which is stay focused on the hard facts, can outcompete the markets in that case. So I'm not suggesting, I hope nothing I said leads you to believe that I think that markets forecast better than alternative forecasting mechanisms. There are instances when they do, like, for example, when you're in uncharted waters, when history is not a good guide to the future. But there are other situations, and Bob Shiller, the Yale economist, got a Nobel Prize for this. Markets can be extremely volatile, and I gave you examples, and prediction markets are not immune to that at all. Yeah, it's great questions.
Hey, Rajiv.
Hey, Scott.
Fun, right? I can't believe you're getting paid for this. Signals now that are being generated, like from high-dimensional spaces to low-dimensional spaces, everything from like credit reports to, like if I submit a paper, somebody can give it a likelihood that it's replicable, this sort of things, right? And so there's a sense in which these are signals that are being generated by a giant algorithm that's to a degree opaque, right? And like China citizenship scores, that sort of thing. How do you categorize those, and what do you see these? I mean, what perils, promise do you see in that whole space?
Credit scores, yeah, you're exactly right. So you've got, payment history, you've got, income reports, and so on and so forth, and it's all compressed into one number, right? The one that I find most concerning is the probability that is communicated by an algorithm to a judge about the likelihood that a particular defendant will reoffend or appear for a scheduled court date, because bail decisions are contingent on that, right? And so that's another example of this massively compressed information. The Hayek quote is also, you got what's going on, all this market for tin, it's all compressed into one price also. So it's not necessarily a new thing, but you're right, it's the prevalence has increased very, very dramatically. So with regard to the algorithms, with regard to bail, they're proprietary. So even with regard to algorithms that are used by law enforcement agencies, the private sector ones are proprietary, so they're particularly opaque. In other cases, you might be able to tell, like, for example, when you submit a paper now to conferences, especially computer science conferences, you get numerical evaluations. You don't get these big, long, free reports and so on. Again, compressing a huge amount of information. But they vary in transparency, and that raises issues. You can't contest them unless there's a process for making them transparent. So in this space of the bail recommendations, there's a move to insist that if they're going to be used, that the mapping from inputs to outputs be made transparent. But then in the deep learning literature, that mapping is not even available. I mean, how do you know what the mapping is? It's just managed to find, and with AI, you've got maybe 1 billion different variables that you're weighting in some way. How do you know what that process is? I honestly don't know the answer to your question. I mean, it's a compression of information in ways that could be disturbing, but what one does about it, I don't know. We're in a world where the dimensionality, I mean, if you think about AI models, my understanding, my limited understanding is that they're basically predictive, right? They attach weights that try to generate a sequence of outputs, right? Like a sentence or a mathematical equation and so on, but with billions of inputs, with weights that might be static, but then it's revised at the next model update. I mean, how do you make these transparent? I don't know if you can even. I don't know. It's an important question, but I don't know the answer.
Let me take the chair's privilege and insert myself real quick for a question. So going back to the kind of like hot button political signals that you were talking about at the start. Just to give a less contemporary hot button example now, like when I was a kid, there was this support the troops statement, right, that became one that was kind of a signal of more than just I support the troops, right?
Yeah.
So I remember there was kind of people had some disagreement about whether to try to like do the thing of like reclaiming that or something, and saying like, well, I'm a Democrat, but I support the troops, right? That didn't really end up happening, but like it was an idea that I saw kind of bandied about in certain ways.
Or the American flag. I mean,
yeah, exactly, right. So like when you have this kind of sorting that's leading to the signal getting a certain kind of information value, sometimes it's possible, and sometimes people try to resist that sorting and try to kind of like remove the information value from the signal.
Yeah.
What do you think about the strategy and rationality of doing that? And what are the situations where it might be a good idea versus a bad idea?
That's really interesting, but there's a collective action problem there. One or two people doing it is not going to make any difference. If a large number of people en masse say, look, I'm going to adopt this thing, I mean, things can change in meaning. That's exactly the idea that the population of users determines the meaning, but then the meaning determines who exits and enters, right? Who adopts and who abandons. And reclaiming these things as a strategy is a smart strategy on paper, but to implement it, you have to solve a collective action problem. Large numbers of people have to do it all at the same time. Maybe you can do it, because social media allows you to leverage, you can have a hashtag can cause large numbers of people can change their behavior in a coordinated way. So I think it's not impossible, but yeah, you can do that. You can dilute a message firstly by making the composition of the people who are using it more diverse. And maybe you can reclaim it because then other people will then abandon it. You see this kind of tussle going on with exactly these kinds of phrases that I talked about in the early part of my talk, where people trying to say no, trying to maintain meaning, but then sometimes you can lose that battle completely. You look at, I'll give you two quick examples. One is the chant that started off at baseball stadiums during the election, which was "Let's go Brandon." I don't know if you heard this. This was people just chanting "Let's go Brandon," right? Which was a way of having a very coarse insult to Joe Biden, right? It was interpreted very quickly. I mean, like people saying, "What's going on? Why are people chanting "Let's go Brandon"?" In fact, there's a candidate who just won the primary in Texas 23 called Brandon, who used that as his logo. But there, it was an insult, trying to insult Biden in a way using an epithet which was not, that was disguised through this. But once that meaning was attached to that message, nobody wanted to use it. Nobody wanted to reclaim it, right? So then that gets entrenched. Who wants to reclaim that message if you don't want to send that message? So it became very, very quickly entrenched and very clear in meaning. But as a different example, think of the word woke, right? And I'm old enough to remember very different usages of it. And, going back to Erykah Badu, and it's sort of somewhat, ironic even, stay woke. And, you see it occasionally. And the way it was weaponized and claimed, by folks who would be described as anti-woke now, was so effective and powerful that people abandoned it actually quite quickly. And that entrenched the meaning. And that was a very, sort of a kind of a successful appropriation of a term, not along the lines that I think you were thinking, but maybe in the opposite direction, where it was, it was people against a nexus of concepts that took a word and made it mean something quite effectively.
Made informative, but in the opposite direction.
Informative in the opposite direction. It really did flip the association of that word almost completely. Yeah.
Incredibly rich and full of so much. I'm still steeping on it. I wanted to ask you a question about market manipulation for predictive markets. So I was totally on board with the thought that, one, the most valuable market to be able to manipulate is the one that people think is the least manipulable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And two, that there are ways of finding someone who's trying, like a single purchaser who's trying to manipulate the market. But then that made me realize that there's another, perhaps more subtle way to manipulate prediction markets, which goes via convincing a lot of individual buyers of the truth of something. And that could be a similar kind of explanatory story for what appeared to be irrationality in the markets in failing to call the election after the election had been called. One other thing that was going on, common cause for January 6th, is that a lot of people genuinely believed that the election had been incorrectly called.
Yeah, I should get your name because I think I want to explore some of these ideas in a bit more depth. But yeah, so if you can convince a lot of people. So firstly, there's a manipulation in the sense that you might think that in that particular instance that I described with regard to December valuations of Trump winning re-election was, could give momentum to processes that might actually make that happen. You could convince people in a decentralized way, right? And then there's a counterpart to that on the crypto-based prediction markets where an individual there's no limit to how many wallets they could operate with. And that's really, that's really how the spoofing strategy works most effectively actually is you take a wallet and you look like you're an insider, you're buying massively, and then you don't dump that when the price goes up. You take the losses, but you use a different wallet to take a much larger opposite position, and the profits accrue there. And it looks like the insider just failed, right? It just looks like somebody who was extremely confident just failed. And so this distributed approach to manipulation, it becomes much, much easier when you have anonymity, as you do on the crypto-based markets without the KYC requirements. So those are really, those are really interesting comments. I'll try to get your name so I can at least acknowledge. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I had a very similar question, actually. So you mentioned two examples that I thought were pretty similar. You talked about the speculative attack on the British pound and also the Mitt Romney thing where one trader was trying to maybe keep Romney's chances above 30%.
Exactly.
Where information actually affects the market endogenously and has sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy role. So do you think safeguards for this kind of manipulation are either feasible or even desirable? Is this just a consequence of these markets that it's neutral?
if you try to manipulate a market in a way that's obvious, it usually fails spectacularly and very quickly. So people have tried, and when David Rothschild and I published that paper, we heard from some people who had tried to manipulate markets. They said, "Oh, I tried to do this, in 2004," and so on and so forth. But if somebody is buying massively and they have a big impact on the price, and the first thing people do is look around for news. What could be driving this? If they can't find the news, and they say, "Hey, there's manipulation," the chat rooms fill up with talk of manipulation, and then the market hits back because it's a profit opportunity, right? So one person, if you're manipulating, you're willing to lose money to change beliefs, which means that you're creating profit opportunity for others. So the only way to manipulate successfully is to disguise it so that your activity looks very much like either somebody with inside information or somebody who's just got very confident beliefs. Now, if you're trying to detect manipulation only from trading activity, and if the manipulation is done in a properly disguised way, then you can't establish it without having a lot of doubt. Because the whole point of doing what they're doing is to act as if they're just a really confident trader. Then it becomes very difficult to adjudicate, even if you had law. So the laws against spoofing and insider trading are very clear. If you don't have insider trading, market manipulation is a bit more of a gray area. But even if you had clear laws against market manipulation, I think that the identification of this is extremely challenging, except in cases where the manipulation is just really obvious. But in those cases, you don't really care because the market takes care of it. So yeah, I think that the detection of, all you can do is to sort of have a probabilistic. So when I did that Romney thing, the tweet, and we tried to think of all kinds of alternative reasons for manipulation other than trying to change the election outcome, and we couldn't. But we can't possibly rule out that it's somebody who just really thinks that all the pollsters are just wrong, that he's just going to do it. He's just going to pull it out somehow. It's really, really confident and is willing to put millions into placing that bet. How do you distinguish that kind of a person from somebody who's actually trying to manipulate? You can only do it probabilistically. So I don't think it's something that can be always decisively identified. Yeah.
Quite close to the end of the time that we have anyway, so let's thank Professor Sethi once more.
Thank you.